Hello, my name is Amber Ollier, and this is my presentation on cognition, learning, and motivation. Cognition. The definition of cognition is the mental processes involved in gaining knowledge or comprehension. A real-world example of cognition would be if I saw that the light for the stove was on and I saw that there was a boiling pot of water on the stove. I would deduct that the stove was hot. This is a real-world example of reasoning through logic. Next, we have learning. The definition of learning is a relatively lasting change in behavior that is the result of experience. An example of learning would be a child copying an adult's actions. Motivation. The definition of motivation is the process that initiates, guides, and maintains goal-oriented behaviors. An example of motivation would be a student wanting to put in a lot of work in their classes to earn an important degree. This shows extrinsic motivation. So now that you know what these processes are, what outside factors affect these processes? So the first outside factor I have is biological. What happens in our brains when we learn? The brain is filled with countless neurons, each one is connected to the other, and when there's input from a neuron, it sends out electric and chemical signals which influence how those neurons react. Together, these billions of neurons form a network, and these make up our senses, thoughts, actions, etc. Practice and repetition triggers those learning networks. For some people, though, different mental disorders can affect how the brain functions. Mental illnesses usually happen from issues with the neurotransmitters, although some can stem from some sort of outside factor. For example, a traumatic event can lead to PTSD. According to ncbi.gov, approximately 20% of Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental disorder. A mental disorder can affect learning by lack of focus, inability to self-motivate, etc. For example, I have ADHD and it can be really hard to focus, which makes learning really difficult for me. Here we have visual examples of brains with mental disorders being compared to brains without. In the top left, we have PTSD compared to a brain without PTSD. Next to it, there's a brain with dyslexia compared to someone without. And on the bottom, it's brain without ADHD compared to a brain with ADHD. As you can see, all of these are different, and there's many differences like lobe size, neurons, etc. So next we have historic factors that affect learning. So the first public school in America opened in 1635 in Virginia, Massachusetts. As time went on, more and more schools opened, eventually leading to the founding of the Board of Education and Department of Education. These organizations were created to establish checks and balances and have a general outline of what will be taught in schools. For a long time, those schools are segregated, and schools for African Americans were underfunded and provided low-quality education. The argument could be made that in a way segregation still exists, as predominantly Black or other minority schools provide lower quality education. Other factors such as the higher likelihood of police being called on students for behavioral issues and more instances of childhood trauma affect how children learn. It could be said that the American public school system is unequal. In 2014, the high school graduation rate for white students was 87% according to the National Center for Education Statistics. For Black students, the rate was 73%. Test scores show a similar racial gap according to APA.org. This is a quote from APA.org that I found interesting. It says, "The rise of the school-to-prison pipeline in recent decades may be the most alarming example of the vicious cycle of poverty and dysfunction. Students branded as bad apples by their teacher find their opportunities for a healthy neurobiological environment diminished, resulting in situations that only perpetuate their experience of toxic stress and, in turn, undesirable behavior." All right, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.